Good morning, First Christian. How are you doing today? Great. Good to hear it. Good to hear it. Well, we have a new sermon series. We had to say goodbye to the skulls and death. I don't know. We'll all be sad to see it go, I know. But we're on to something else. And, you might say to yourself, Pastor Steve, the topics, they're so inspired. How do you come up with them? How in the world do you come up with them? And I'll tell you what, man. I was in my prayer tower, and the Holy Spirit came upon me and said, "Steve, I know this is out of left field, but please preach on Thanksgiving." That might have been how it happened, but instead I kind of looked at the calendar and I said, "Hey, Thanksgiving seems appropriate." And it's not to diminish the work of the Holy Spirit, because I think that the Holy Spirit was involved in setting up our calendar, but it's just that I needed more of a clue to how to proceed with our sermon series. So because it's Thanksgiving, we are going to talk about giving thanks. And I'm doing this because I think that it's one of those things where it's on the calendar. We know it's coming, and it kind of can become rote. I don't know about you, but I find that a lot of the holidays that we come every year, there are times when you think about it and it feels especially powerful to you, and you're in the spirit of the holiday while it's going on. But there's other times when you're not in the spirit of the holiday while it's going on, and instead you're just kind of going through the motions. And I wanted to make sure that this year, for Thanksgiving, that maybe we gave it a little bit more time and attention than often we do. And so today we're going to talk about giving thanks to the Lord. We're going to talk about the foundations of Thanksgiving, because I think Thanksgiving is one of those things where it's such a part of our life that we don't often look deeply enough into it, if that makes any sense. So Luke 17 is where we'll be. If you want to turn to Luke 17, we're going to be in verse 11, and we're going to go through verse 19. I wanted to say before we got started, though, I wanted to say a thing about our special congregational meeting that we have coming up. We're looking at making a change to the bylaws, which amounts to getting rid of one sentence in that. And that one sentence is that, the elders and deacons, they, after a 3-year term, there's a mandatory year off before they can be an elder or deacon again. And the reason that we're removing that is because several times over the last couple of decades, we've run into problems with, there's a minimum number, especially in the eldership, there's a minimum number that we need to have. And what happens is we go around to the people who have been nominated and the people who have indicated interest in serving and or whatever, and we approach them. There are times when the number of people that are finding it convenient to serve because of the situation, circumstances in their life is not equal to the number that we need. And this puts us in a bind. And normally what you would say was, well, maybe somebody who's already done a 3-year term can do another one, but this sentence in the bylaws prevents us from doing that. And so in the past, we've actually changed that temporarily for a year to get us through the difficulty that we find ourselves in. And this year, what we're saying is, well, let's just remove that. And so that, again, they'll still be accountable to the congregation. After 3 years, they're still going to need to be reelected by the congregation. It's just that they won't have to take that mandatory year off. So if you're in favor of that, vote yes. If you're not in favor of that, vote no. But not today, on December 10th. So let's get on with our sermon today on Luke chapter 17, starting in verse 11, going through verse 19. Now, this is one of those stories that I think we all have read, we've all heard about, but maybe we're going to investigate some of the aspects of it a little more deeply today. Luke 17, verses 11 through 19, it says, "On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee, and as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance." Now, this is not unusual. If the lepers are standing at a distance, it's because they're supposed to stand at a distance. That was the nature of the requirements under the law for people who had leprosy, as they were separated from the assembly. They were separated from the society, and so they were kind of in a real bind. So he was met by lepers who stood at a distance. Verse 13 continues, and it says, lifted up their voice, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well." So, this is a very interesting passage for us, and it deals with Thanksgiving in a very interesting way once you understand the background of kind of the undertones of what's going on in this passage. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the symbol of leprosy. What does it mean, and what does it have to do with this idea of giving thanks? We're going to look at the context of this passage, because that's super important in understanding what's going on here. And then finally, we're going to talk about the primacy of faith. So let's get into the symbol of leprosy. Now, we've mentioned some of these things before, but we need to kind of bring them together in the view of this issue of thanksgiving and being gracious. So leprosy, we shouldn't confuse it with what we call leprosy today. It's not the same thing. If you look at in the Old Testament, we'll look at some of the Old Testament passages, but if you look at some of the Old Testament passages, it's clear from the way that they're describing this condition of leprosy that it's not the same thing. And so don't think in your mind, oh, this is just someone with Hansen's disease. It's not. This is something different. And it's also clear from Scripture that this is something that it has a symbolic significance. And that symbolic significance is clear because the same condition that can affect your skin is also mentioned in the context of clothing and also buildings, houses. And so we know it's not like, whatever disease you have, and when you have leprosy, it's the same disease can affect houses and clothing. That's just not the way that it works. So we know that there's symbolic significance to this. This is some kind of a real condition that was occurring at this time and in this place, but it was symbolically linked to other things, and they meant something. Remember that Israel was to be a priest to the nations. It was a lot of what God was doing with Israel was he was doing things that would symbolically represent his relationship with humankind. And so we have to understand that this issue of leprosy was one that had spiritual significance. All right, so if we look at Leviticus chapter 13, and we're going to look at verses 47 through 54. It says that when there is a case of leprous disease in a garment, whether a woolen or a linen garment, in warp or woof of linen or wool, or in a skin of anything made of skin, if the disease is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the skin, or in the warp or the woof, or in any of the article made of the skin, it is a case of leprous disease, and it shall be shown to the priest. And the priest shall examine the disease and shut up that which has the disease for 7 days. Then he shall examine the disease on the 7th day. If the disease has spread in the garment, in the warp or in the woof, or in the skin, whatever be the use of the skin, the disease is a persistent leprous disease, it is unclean. And he shall burn the garment, or the warp, or the woof, the linen, the wool or the linen, or any article made of the skin that is diseased, for it is a persistent leprous disease, it shall be burned in the fire. So what you have here is you have this, and this is written in very, biblical language. It's a very repetitive, and this is why, people read this. This is where, I don't know if you guys have ever decided, I'm going to read the Bible in a year. This is the kind of stuff you get to, and you're like, oh, have you guys ever experienced that? You think, wow, how am I going to get through this? Well, once you start building your knowledge base in how the Bible works, and especially the Old Testament works, this starts to become more interesting because you start seeing connections. And the connection here is an important one, because really what this is symbolizing is it's symbolizing a spiritual disease. Now, there's some kind of physical thing going on here, but we shouldn't focus on the physical thing. What we should focus on is the fact that it symbolizes a spiritual condition. And this spiritual condition is infesting something and spreading through something. And the fact that it can happen in somebody's body or somebody's clothing or a building is very significant, because what that represents is it represents an entity. And that entity has got a disease in it. And the fact that this disease is white, and it's described a lot as white with some reddish in it, like if it's in your skin, it's described as white with some reddish in it. And it's not something that's on the surface, it goes into the flesh. The idea behind this seems to be, as theologians look at this, the idea seems to be that there is a spiritual disease that can inhabit a group. It can inhabit a body. And a body is something that we think of our bodies as this physical thing that we inhabit. But what we don't understand is that the body is symbolic of a group, something that has a spiritual identity, right? So like a church, like we're First Christian Church of Tempe. We have a spiritual identity. People they can't pick us up and look at our heel and it says property of First Christian Church of Tempe. That's not how it works, right? When you belong to this group, it's not like there's something printed on the bottom of your foot so that if somebody finds you, they can return you. It's a spiritual entity that we exist in. And the body is representative in the Old Testament of spiritual entities, and so is a house, because you think of a household, what belongs in a house is spiritual. And the other thing that it represents is like clothing represents this too, because the clothes are representative of the body as well. So what I'm getting at here is important to understand. It's kind of like this: the container represents the thing contained. Right? And so you've got this spiritual disease in this container, and it's a picture of a spiritual disease within a group, a spiritual identity. So to think about it this way, you can kind of think, like if I said to somebody, let's say I say to my wife, I say, can you go get my stapler? It's somewhere in the building, go get my stapler. My stapler is the one that belongs to me. It belongs in my office. But even if it leaves my office, it still belongs to me and it still belongs in my office, right? And the thing is spiritually it's identified with me. But what does it mean for my stapler to be my stapler? Right? What does it mean for it to be my stapler? Because technically it really isn't mine, it's yours. Right? It belongs to the church. But I can say, go get my stapler, and people will know what I mean, and they won't disagree with that idea, right? What does it mean to be my stapler? Well, it means that it's the staple that I use. It submits to my desires. It submits to my will, and I have authority over it and responsibility for it. Like if you guys drove up one Sunday morning and you saw a stapler sitting out in the parking lot, and it said Steve Stapler on it, you might say to yourself, well, why isn't he not taking care of the things that he's been entrusted with? Right? You might say that. You might say, he has not only does he have authority over this, but he has responsibility for it. And to understand this, we have to understand that ownership in the biblical sense is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And we have to clear out we've all been infected to some extent with kind of Marxist thinking. That the idea of something being elevated or something having mastery over or something having authority over automatically means that it's bad. Marxist thinking had this idea that in all of history there were the haves and the have-nots, and they were always at war. There was always a fight. And the have-nots were always the victims of the haves. This is a picture of worldly leadership. This is a picture of worldly ownership. It's not a picture of biblical leadership or biblical ownership. Because in biblical leadership and biblical ownership, to have authority means that you have the responsibility to glorify something. That there's a burden that's placed on you for the care of that thing. So what exactly is leprosy? Well, leprosy is a false glory that spreads through something. It spreads through an entity. It spreads through a spiritual being. It represents the idea of basically elevating yourself and taking on a glory that doesn't really belong to you. And what would happen within leprosy is it's kind of the idea of saying, I am my own person. I am my own being. I am a self-created person. I am somebody who has the glory. I don't need this. The idea behind it is the idea of pride. And the idea of pride will always separate us from the group. So why is it that at the beginning of this, it says, as he entered the village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance? The idea was because symbolically, leprosy was the accumulation of glory to yourself, of pride, and it separates you from the community. And so the idea was that they were separated from the community to represent this. Notice that in the issue of clothing that we read about, that there's the idea that a priest would examine this, and after 7 days, if it's gotten worse, if it's spread, then the thing has to be burned in the fire. The picture here is a clear one. It's the idea of judging after 7 days. Now, what does that mean to judge after 7 days? Well, it means that 7 days represents a complete period of time. And 7 days can mean 7 actual days, as it would in this, but that 7 days represents a complete period of time. And that could be anything from your entire life to the history of the world. It means the cycle of time. And the idea here is that if you have a false glory, if you have a leprosy, if you have a spiritual pride in you that says, I don't need God, I stand apart from Him, I don't need the group, I don't need any of these things, that if that runs its course in your life, at the end, what will happen is you will face judgment. It's interesting that this idea of leprosy affected persons, and we read about that, but the effect that it had on clothing in buildings is very strange, because we don't really see that very much in Scripture. It could affect a house, and what would happen is similar to the piece of clothing, a priest would inspect it, and they would shut it up for a period of time, and then they would come back, and if it still had that leprosy, then it would be destroyed. And the only time that we know that this actually comes to fruition in Scripture is an interesting one. If you turn to Matthew chapter 21, starting in verse 12, this is Jesus at the end of His ministry. It says, Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. Now, this is really important because this is at the end of Jesus' ministry. This is actually the second time He's cleansed the temple. He went in the first time and He examined the temple, and He found it to be wanting. He found that it had a leprosy in it. And now He comes and examines it again, and He's passing judgment on it, and it will be destroyed in 70 AD. Exactly what happens to a building when it has leprosy. Notice in verse 13, He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer." My house. He uses those words for a reason, because He's pointing out that this is a house. It's God's house. And because it's a house, it can be examined for leprosy. And if it is to have leprosy found in it a second time, it's going to be destroyed. And it will be destroyed in 70 AD. My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. Notice also what the issue is behind this cleansing of the temple. Jesus is saying, look, my house is supposed to be a house of prayer. It's supposed to be a house where you recognize your relationship with the Father, where you submit to His will, where you give Him glory. And instead what you're doing is you're turning around and you're robbing the people that you have charge and authority over. You see, what's supposed to happen is you're supposed to be in submission to God. You're supposed to see that the master is God and you are the servant, that He is the one who has authority, and that any glory that you have comes from your obedience to Him and His authority. But instead what you're doing is you're taking on your own glory. You're saying, we are the leaders here, and you're using that glory to rob the people below you who don't have the authority that you do. It is a false glory that you've taken for yourself. And because it's a false glory that you've taken for yourself, judgment is going to be passed. In verse 14 it says, "And the blind and the lame came to Him in the temple, and He healed them." You see what's happening? Do you see how brilliant this passage is? While He's calling out their leadership for how false the glory is in it, He's making a picture of the way that leadership should be expressed. He comes to the temple where they are robbing the people who are vulnerable, where they are robbing the people who have less power and less authority than they have. And he presents this image of how God actually has authority, how he actually practices his ownership of us. The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant, and they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise?" And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. This is incredibly important. This passage is exactly like the passage that we read about the lepers that were healed. Maybe you don't see all the connections, but they're there. Notice one of the things that's really important is the result of this. The result of Jesus coming and cleansing the temple and using his authority as it should be used is that there are people crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David." They are praising and thanking him. The destruction of the temple will happen in 70 AD because it is leprous. That is the symbol of leprosy, and it plays a huge part in this passage in Luke 17. Let's go on to the context of this passage and look at the context and obedience. What does this have to do with gratitude and the point of the story? What does this leprosy issue have to do with what's happening here? Well, let's notice the context. Let's look a little deeper into this. Let's look at Luke chapter 17, verse 7 through 10. What precedes this? In Luke chapter 17, 7 through 10, it says, "Will any one of you who has a servant plowing or keeping sheep say to him, when he has come in from the field, 'Come at once and recline at table'? Will he not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me and dress properly and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you will eat and drink'? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, 'We are unworthy servants, we have only done what was our duty.'" Now this seems really harsh, doesn't it? This doesn't seem like a Jesus saying. Like you look at this and you say, maybe, how did this get in here? Because Jesus is saying, we would think that Jesus would say, "Hey, you have a servant and he's out watching the sheep, and when he comes in from watching the sheep, you say, 'Man, you must be tired, you must be famished. Let me make you some hot, sheep food.' Mutton, mutton? I don't know, rack of lamb? I don't eat sheep very much. You can't hunt them. Let's just say that. Yeah, it's too easy. So he comes in and he says, "You got this shepherd, right? And he's been working all day, and he's saying, 'This is not what you do. You as the master, you don't say, "Oh man, you've been working so hard. I appreciate it so much. I've made you this huge meal. Sit down." Now that seems harsh, and you think to yourself, why is Jesus saying that? And why is that in the context of this? Well, remember here that the next story we have here is the story of the 10 lepers. When these things were put together by the authors, they were put together for a reason. There's not just random things just thrown together. There's a flow to it. And so we have to understand that these two things kind of explain each other. You've got 10 lepers out there. And the 10 lepers are calling out to Jesus. And it's interesting that they do that because, they're from a distance. They have a tough life, right? When you have a tough life, you want help. You want to resolve it. And so they say, "Jesus, help us." And Jesus is interesting because he could have just healed them, right? But he doesn't do that. He says to them, "Go show yourselves to the priest." He's giving them a command. In the same way, in the next or the previous story, What's happening is Jesus is saying, look, if you have a servant who's out there watching the sheep, and he comes back in, you don't just start, doing all this stuff for him. And his point is important. The master has given a command to the shepherd to watch the sheep. Now, we don't put these two things together, but I think Jesus is intentionally putting them together. And I think if we can understand this, it will transform how we look at our lives and how we express gratitude. Jesus is saying, look, I've given these lepers a command in the same way as this master gives a command to the shepherd to go and watch the sheep. Now, here's the issue, and this is a hard one for us to swallow. And I know that as I'm saying this, some people will go, no, that's not it. Hey, man, you're free to believe it or not. And I'm not always right. I get things wrong. So be cautious. The question is this. When the master gives the command to the shepherd to watch the sheep, who should be grateful to whom? Right? In our minds, we're modern people, in our minds we say, man, that master should be so grateful to the shepherd for going out and watching the sheep. That's how we think. We're modern people. That is not how the ancient world thought at all. That's not what they thought at all. They would say that the shepherd should be grateful to the master for giving him the command to go and watch the sheep. Now, why is that? It's backwards to us, right? Well, why is it frontwards to them? Because in their mind, the master owns the sheep, and the servant doesn't. And without the command of the master, he has no business with the sheep. He's not involved with the sheep. He has no participation in the sheep. But because of the command of the master, he now has participation in the sheep of the master. And what that means is that when a time comes, he gets to participate in the fruit of the sheep. So he should be grateful to the master, not the other way around. And I think that's exactly what Jesus' point was in telling the story. Look, he says this. Let's look at it more closely. He says, will any one of you who has a servant plowing or keeping sheep say to him when he is coming from the field, come at once and recline at table? Will you not rather say, come prepare supper for me, dress properly, and serve me while I eat, and afterward you will eat and drink? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. He's saying, look, the only reason the servant gets to eat the sheep is because the master has invited him to participate in shepherding. And it's not the master who owes the servant something when he is obedient to the command. It's the servant who owes the master something. And so he honors the master by preparing the meal for him, and then he gets to participate in the glory of what's going on. Now, this is hard for us to understand, I know, but I think that's the way that it exists because that's the mindset of the time in which Jesus taught it. The master has commanded the servant to watch the sheep, and he gets the fruit of the sheep. Now, how does this connect? Well, this is really important. Notice that in verse 13, the very next thing that happens in this text, after Jesus tells the story of the master and the servant, and who should be grateful to who, notice the very next thing. It says, verse 13, they lifted up their voices saying, Jesus, Master. Did you catch that? Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. They're acknowledging Jesus is the master, and they're saying, have mercy on us. They are apart from the group, and they are calling out because the burden of their apartness, the burden of this disease of leprosy has become too much for them. And they're saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. And notice what he does is he gives them a command. This is so fascinating. He doesn't just heal them, he gives them a command. When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." Notice what's happening here. Go and show yourselves to the priest. Well, they have leprosy. So do you think to yourself, should I go and show myself to the priest? I have leprosy. Notice something else really fascinating. As they went, they were cleansed. Do you see that? As they went, they had to make up their mind to be obedient to the command of the master before they were healed. They had to make up their minds. Am I going to trust or am I not going to trust? Do you see how glorious this is? Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. One of them understood what was happening. They're not healed until they trust in the command of the master. And then, notice what Jesus says. They have to trust in his command. Then notice what Jesus said. He says, "Rise and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." You see, without the trust in the command of the master, they aren't healed. If the servant, and what Jesus was saying earlier, if the servant comes in from watching the sheep and his master says, "Okay, here's the deal. Let's get, man, we got mealtime coming up. I want you to get dressed. I want you to put the meal on the table. I want you to get dressed appropriately. I want you to serve my food, and then you get to participate." What happens if the servant comes in and says, "Man, I've been working for you all day"? That might cross my mind if I was that servant. I'd be like, "You don't know what it's like to mess with these sheep. Do you know what it's like?" I had no idea. I watched a documentary. I think I might have mentioned this before. I watched a documentary about this guy watching sheep, and he was about to have a stroke. He was so angry at these sheep because they kept doing the dumbest things. He never gave them a minute of peace. They were constantly into things and going all over the place and getting out of stuff and going through fences. And they were just constantly causing him problems. And every time he went to sit down, he had to get up again and mess with these sheep. And he was so mad. He would be swearing and cussing. And, "I want to kill you." All this stuff. I could see myself like that. And then you come in, and the master says to you, he says, "Hey, great. It's good times now. How about you make me dinner, dress appropriately, put on some nice clothes, get rid of the sheep-smelling clothes you got on now, put on some nice clothes, serve me, and then you can sit down and eat." And you say, "No. Don't you know what I've done for you?" You see, you're not healed until you understand it's not what you've done for him, it's what he's done for you. He has invited you in to the glory of shepherding. What was the problem with the religious leaders when Jesus goes in and he cleanses the temple? They do not understand that they've been invited into the glory of shepherding. Jesus heals in the temple because he knows that his Father has invited him into the glory of shepherding. He doesn't see it as a burden. He sees it as a blessing. Jesus all the time is he's going around and he's healing people and telling them, "Shh, be quiet. Don't tell anybody." He's working himself to the bone. He's having to get away from people because the crowds are pressing in on him. He's tired as he can be, and he has to withdraw to a lonely place to pray to God, to restore his energy. Why? Because he's been brought into this amazing glory of shepherding. And it's not something that he despises. Instead, he can't keep himself away from it. He uses himself up. He's wrung out like a rag. Let's talk about the primacy of faith, because you can't really get around this without talking about this. Chapter 17 begins with this idea of temptation. And that temptation will come, but man, woe to the people who it comes by. And then after that, in chapter 17, verse 5 and 6, has something really fascinating to say to us. It says, the apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. And the Lord said, if you had faith like the grain of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. All of this comes after this passage in 5 and 6 where the disciples say, increase our faith. Oh, you want your faith increased? Let me tell you the story about a guy who has a servant. And the servant's out taking care of the sheep. And when he comes in, does the master say, oh, let me wait on you? No, he says, you see what Jesus is doing. And then this happens with the lepers. And what Jesus is doing is saying, you want your faith increased? You need to grapple with something in your life. And that thing that you have to grapple with, the thing that's keeping you from faith, is your ingratitude. It's your leprosy. It's your false glory. It's the fact that you don't understand that every command that God gives you is for your blessing. That when you see God's giving you a task, God's laying something heavy on your shoulder, you see that that's what's happening. That's not what's happening. God is inviting you to the glory of being like Him. God is not giving you a burden, He's giving you a blessing. If you want your faith increased, well, that's what needs to happen. If you trust, if you have faith, if you have confidence that God is commanding you to give you a blessing, you will obey and you will be joyful about it. You see, what should happen is after joyfully watching the sheep, the shepherd should come in, and when the master says, how about some new clothes and how about laying out my dinner, he should say, man, that's fantastic. And now you get to enjoy the meal. You see, if you don't have participation in the beginning, you don't have participation at the end. You see, if you don't have participation in the shepherding, if you don't have participation in the meal preparation, then you don't have participation in the consumption of the meal. You see, that's not the way that it works. You sow and you reap and you harvest and then you feast. It's all part of the same thing. And if you feast without doing the rest of it, you have false glory, because the glory is not in the feasting. That's just the manifestation of the glory. It's like saying, I want to win a World Series. I want to win a Super Bowl. You understand that the glory is not in the Super Bowl. That's just the manifestation of it. The glory is not in the World Series. The glory is in the road, the transformation, the day in, the day out work, the becoming a better baseball player or a better football player, of participating in that. Without that, you're not anything. You know, it's interesting. I once had the opportunity. You know that when I was a younger man, and foolish in all my ways, I liked the Dallas Cowboys. You guys remember that, right? I once had the opportunity to walk, to trod on the sacred ground of Texas Stadium. I was on the field of Texas Stadium. The lights, there were thousands of people in the stadium, and I was on the field. Are you impressed? It was Promise Keepers, and there was floor seating. You see, it wasn't glorious. Why? Because I had done nothing to earn it. It wasn't, you see, to be recognized for something that isn't who you are is no glory at all. The relationship, and here's so important, the relationship is not completed or perfected until you give thanks. So what's happening here is that God is giving, let's go back to our original text, the 10 lepers. They say, Master, have mercy on us. And he gives them a command. He says, go show yourselves to the priest. And then they're obedient to the command, and their obedience to the command glorifies them. But notice that it's not complete until the one guy comes back. Was no one found to return and give praise except this foreigner? And he said to him, rise and go on your way. Your faith has made you well. You see, here's the thing that's interesting is I've looked at this a long time, over a number of years, and I've thought, what does that mean? Does it mean the other people weren't made well? Does it mean the other people got leprosy again? Does it mean that, I don't know. It doesn't tell us. But I think that there's something more spiritual going on than this. I think that whatever the case, if those guys stayed free from leprosy or whether the leprosy, I don't know what happened, but I do know this. I think that what's happened here is that the only one that was really made well was this one. And that's because the real problem is our relationship with God. And that relationship with God, that covenant with God, has not been completed until Thanksgiving is given. Because until Thanksgiving is given, you really don't understand the relationship with God. We talk here about believe, belong, become, and all of these are important. You have to believe that God's giving you commands out of love. You have to belong to that covenant relationship of love with Him. And then what happens is you can become. And when you become thankful, you glorify God as He has glorified you. The glory now goes both ways. He has glorified you by transforming you into glory. You have glorified Him by praising Him for what He has done. When you are transformed into somebody who is thankful, you make manifest your understanding of His love for you. Here's the thing. Until you give thanks, you don't really understand God's love for you. You haven't understood the whole experience. You're still like the guy who's out there tending sheep and irritated that he has to come in and cook the meal. Until you give thanks, you haven't reinforced or understood your value. Man, this is so important. Do you understand how valuable you are to God? You don't until you really understand that He has given you, He has invited you into this shepherding because He loves you, because He wants to glorify you, and because He wants to make you glorious. Until you have become somebody who gives thanks, you have not oriented yourself to community with God. Ingratitude is rejection of God. It's rejection of His love for you. And it leads to false glory and self-sufficiency. Giving thanks makes you real and complete. And it completes the covenant with God. Giving thanks makes your heart joyful through worship. This is what giving thanks does. When we have to believe in the glory and the love of God, we have to belong to a relationship with Him. And that relationship is made manifest as we become people who give thanks to God.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to this church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.